All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Hunt, Director of Education and Public Programs at MoCA, and I'm very excited for today's panel on the occasion of Real World's Brassaï, Arbus, Goldin, organized by Assistant Curator Lanka Tattersall, who's with us today. We've assembled this dynamic panel to present on their work as artists, as art historians, as photojournalists, but also to explore ideas of fake news versus hard truths. I took some creative license with the exhibition title and just what's cycling in our news feeds and in the current state of affairs globally. So I'm really looking forward to this representation of a diversity of perspectives, approaches to art making, and describing the world in which we live. So I'm just going to jump right into everyone's bios so that we can dive into their conversation, which will be moderated, and followed by a few questions from the audience, should you have them. Sadie Barnette. Her drawings, photography, and large-scale installations relish in the abstraction of city space, asserting the power of the personal as political. Her recent works engage as primary source material the 500-page FBI surveillance file kept on her father, Rodney Barnette, who also joins us today, who founded the Compton, California chapter of the Black Panther Party. Barnette's work has been exhibited throughout the country and internationally at venues including the Studio Museum in Harlem, where she was an artist in residence, as well as the Oakland Museum of California, Goodman Gallery in Johannesburg, South Africa, so on and so forth. She is represented by Charlie James Gallery here in Los Angeles and lives and works in Oakland and Compton. Barbara Davidson is a 3-time Pulitzer Prize and Emmy Award-winning photojournalist, best known for her work on victims of gang violence in Los Angeles. Barbara has mastered her storytelling approach through multiple assignments, spanning over 2 decades and across 52 countries, covering war, humanitarian crises, and the human condition for the Los Angeles Times, the Dallas Morning News, the Washington Times, also so on and so forth. Barbara has covered both breaking world events and underreported stories, turning a compassionate eye towards individuals in our communities here and abroad. Mariah Garnett mixes documentary, narrative, and experimental filmmaking practices to make work that accesses existing people and communities beyond her immediate experience. Using source material that ranges from found text to iconic gay porn stars, Garnett often inserts herself into her films, creating cinematic allegories that codify and locate identity. She has had solo exhibitions at the Metropolitan Arts Center, LTD Los Angeles, Louis B. James Gallery, and her work is also shown at SF MoMA, Red Cat, White Columns, the Ann Arbor Film Festival, and the 2014 Made in LA Biennial. And last but certainly not least, our moderator today, Michelle Maydanchik, is an art historian and postdoctoral fellow at the Getty Research Institute currently, and she studies the history and theory of performance art with a focus on post-war Russia. After receiving her PhD in art history from the University of Chicago in 2014, Michelle was appointed Mellon Kiter postdoctoral fellow and visiting assistant professor of Russian art at Amherst College from 2014 to 16. Her research and teaching focuses on art's relationship to globalization, mass media, politics, and the commodity form. Please join me in welcoming our panelists for today.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Shout out to all the moms, including mine, who's not here today, but is on my mind. So I guess I'm to begin. That's me. I'm going to just quickly sort of introduce and situate the project that I've been working on recently, and then hopefully we can bounce all of our work off of one another's and hopefully hear from you guys as well. This is from my exhibition called Dear 1968, and it uses as the basis for this work 500 pages of FBI surveillance that me and my father and our family requested through the Freedom of Information Act about 6 years ago at this point, to sort of validate my father's experience with informants, agent provocateurs, and infiltration within the Black Panther Party, as well as just to use this to retell this history in our own words. So you can see in this exhibition, there's a lot of different mediums and surfaces that are involved. In the back, there's a wallpaper created from stamps within the FBI file. One of them reads racial int sect, so racial intelligence section, in case there was like any ambiguity about what's going on here. And this was an actual, object created sitting on hundreds of FBI desks across the country. You can see in the portraits in the back, on the left is my father in a military uniform. He's been drafted and is going to soon be sent to Vietnam. This is 1966. In the right, he's in what we think of as the Black Panther uniform. The year is 1968. He's come home from the war and says that he still feels like he's at war because of the way the police are treating the Black community, which is something that we see after every war. So that was just one of the many things within the file. This is 28 pages of the file that really highlights a few of the key findings. These pages are mounted on a neon pink plexi, so you get this sort of future-y or dystopian sort of buzz and glow around them. They're also splashed with pink spray paint and adorned with these rhinestone gems. I spent a lot of time studying about J. Edgar Hoover and thinking about really what would piss him off the most, and I figured splashing pink spray paint on these like very officious, authoritative government documents that supposedly have this like truthiness to them, splashing them with pink spray paint, thinking about like my generation as the 80s, graffiti, Reagan era baby, interacting with this like teletype 60s vernacular. And this page you can read, it's very simple, but to me acts almost as a photograph in this like very ghost-like way of capturing this moment. It's a very, sort of plain moment. Nothing happens, there's no drama, but there's just this underlying presence of these agents at all times. This is like 11 days after Angela Davis is acquitted. There was no charges ever on my father, but they're still being observed. I'm gonna keep it short, but this was one of the things that we found within the file, was that my father was fired from his job at the post office for the reason was cohabiting with a woman he wasn't married to. So in all of these 500 pages, there's nothing illegal that they can find, so all they can do is go after his employment at the post office as a government employee. So the second paragraph that's outlined with these like pink, purple, periwinkle gems is a statement that my father gives to the post office, and it was just, well, to the post office unbeknown also to the FBI. And it was just one of these moments where you get these clash of the different voices that are present, and I felt like my father's voice really rang out in how earnest he is and how big picture he is, and bothering to explain these sort of bigger concepts of morality and family and what that can look like, while still, being criminalized. I mean, you would think living with the woman you have a child with is the right thing to do, but it's like, again, this criminalization of Black family. A lot of the pages are heavily redacted, which I think is another thing in terms of thinking about truth and lies and what's omitted and what's seen and what is illuminated by what is omitted, and also sort of holding space for what could possibly be there. This is a graphite pencil drawing of the only image within the file, which is this mugshot of my father. Thinking about the way that mugshots function to instantly dehumanize someone and make them a number. So by rendering it by hand and pencil, it's trying to slow down that process and turn it into a portrait of a freedom fighter and a father, and very much a full human being, as opposed to this sort of literally flattened, anonymous male Black K6 number. Alongside that is this J. Edgar Hoover signature, which is also a pencil drawing, but taken directly from the file. It hangs on this wallpaper. And then lastly, there's this other sort of element at play, which is these spaces to dream, to imagine, these glitterscapes and family moments to sort of point to what's at stake, not only in this government surveillance, but in the work that my father is doing at the time. This is a collage of my dad holding me as a tiny one, and not necessarily knowing what the truth is or what the future is, but having these glitter spaces hold space for those types of engagements and conversations. So that is a whirlwind tour, and hopefully we can talk more about some of these themes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that I need. I'll just leave that up there for a while. So the work I make is mostly film and video, and I consider my work to be mostly experimental documentaries. And what I mean by that is I don't ever try to sort of like directly represent another person or their experience or try to tell the truth about another person, but kind of project a fantasy onto them and then unravel it over the course of the film. So it ultimately becomes a portrait of my relationship to the subject. So some of the projects that I have worked on, like this one here, is actually like one of the main strategies for doing this, for this sort of like projection and then unraveling, is I'll dress up like my subjects. So that's maybe more the experimental part of the documentary sentence that I just said. But so this is a film I made in 2012 called Encounters I May or May Not Have Had with Peter Berlin. And Peter Berlin was a sort of gay sex icon from the 1970s. And I was interested in him because he sort of embodied this like pre-AIDS era of sort of like gay liberation utopia. But he also kind of embodied the sort of like cliche idea that I have about what an artist is supposed to be, which is someone who will make artwork in a vacuum, regardless of any kind of external circumstance. So yeah, so I made this film about him, and I use as many sort of strategies and materials that are at my disposal. So I'll use like narrative filmmaking conventions, I'll use cinema verite, I'll often pass the camera to my subject, or do other things like hand paint film. And, oh, this is a still from inside his apartment. He has a life-size cardboard cutout of himself in his apartment. Often when I'm making a project, there'll be these sort of like spin-off installations or other material forms of the film. So this is a installation version of the same film. So I took the footage from the first section of the film and looped it on two 16mm projectors that were projected off a disco ball. And that's kind of, speaking to the duality and mirroring of the image. Also that same year I made a film about, what is this movie about? It's about, it started out as about a transgendered conquistador from the 1500s. And it's based on this memoir. And then I met this 9-year-old kid from Santa Monica who like sort of had the same type of bravado and gender presentation as this historical figure. So this is another example of a film that uses all these different strategies to kind of attack a subject or a relationship or a feeling and unravel it over the course of time. So I would script scenes that were based on our interactions and then re-perform them with her and shoot them like a narrative. I also did some sort of like dress-up fantasy sequences and some historical reenactments. And that brings me to the current project that I'm working on, which I want to spend a little bit more time on. So this is an installation shot of this project called Other and Father. This is the first iteration of a much larger project, which is actually called Trouble, that I'm finishing sometime this year, hopefully. But it's about my relationship with my dad, who is from Belfast, Northern Ireland. And that's him over there, the very pale young fellow there. And then what I did, okay, so yeah, I'll give you some context for this. So my dad is Protestant from Northern Ireland, and he was dating a Catholic girl in the late 60s, and there was a civil rights movement in the late 60s there that modeled itself after our civil rights movement here. And the BBC did this documentary about my dad and his girlfriend, and they called it like Romeo and Juliet. But my dad was kind of like actually a political agitator, and not like a loyalist Protestant. The context, like his family's kind of like Trump supporters. So it's like if he kind of went into some kind of like Black Lives Matter scenario. So it was kind of, he cut all ties with his family. That's like a simplistic way of explaining it. But so the BBC did this documentary about them, and a lot of it was fabricated to sort of fit their own agenda about how this was like two star-crossed lovers that were trying to get married, and which they weren't trying to do. So I wound up finding the footage and reenacted it with me playing him. And I didn't grow up with him, so this is kind of like a way for me to get to know him in some respects, but also like trying to consider these sort of like historical parallels between different cultural contexts and political struggles, and how they keep kind of mirroring each other over time. So this was the first iteration of that project, and it's installed as this double projection that's synced, so all of the talking is coming out of my dad's mouth, but I'm sort of lip syncing along to it. And then that's inside a projection room, and then outside there's this wall text that is like a journalistic account, or it's like from my journal, an account of the 6 weeks that I spent with him, which was the longest amount of time I'd ever spent with him, and these interactions that we had around this news footage. And then that on the little monitor is him watching the footage of himself as a young man for the first time, because he never saw it when it aired in 1971, and sort of being like shocked at the BBC voiceover saying that they were going to get married and that he was looking for a job in sales and all this stuff that wasn't true, and leaving out all of the political context. There's one moment where they mention he's part of the People's Democracy, but that was kind of where they left that. Yeah, so I will leave it there and pass it along to you.
So, oh, thank you. I have to thank Amanda for putting me on this panel, because as a photojournalist, we don't often find ourselves on conceptual art panels. So thank you. And I'm going to talk quickly about a project that I essentially embedded myself in here in Los Angeles. So I was a staff photographer for 20 years at different papers, and a year ago I left the Los Angeles Times because I felt in many ways, in creative ways, it was too stifling for me, and I wasn't allowed to actually do much outside of the brand. So the first decade of my career, I was covering a lot of conflict. I was covering Afghanistan and Israel and Congo, and I was basically doing a lot of what we call parachute journalism, where you drop in, not literally, but you do, and you cover the stories there. And then I moved to Los Angeles, and ironically, I had started seeing the same sensibilities that I had seen overseas, where you would have incredible acts of violence play out, and there would be no consequence. So I pitched to my editors that we should do a story it's a non-declared war zone where people are being shot regularly in Los Angeles, and nothing's happening to the people that this is happening to. And so this is Erica. She was only 10 years old, living in Compton, and she was shot by a drive-by, and she was hit 3 times. Now, I'm not going to go into every story, but I want to tell you generally why I wanted to do this project, because the level of violence had become so normalized here that I thought, as a Canadian living in this country who didn't grow up with this kind of violence, I thought that there was something very wrong with this. The fact that you could have a memorial on one side of the frame and a young woman celebrating her quinceañera, and the blood drops essentially reach the tip of her dress, I thought, people are so desensitized by this violence now that it's a problem. And so I had a hard time convincing my editors that we should do this story, because they felt that violence had come down in Los Angeles, and they said, look, the statistics are better now than they were, let's say, a decade ago. And I said, yeah, that's true, but you know what? As a newspaper, we owe it to the people who live in these communities to at least, you know, highlight these unheard voices, because this violence is happening on a regular basis. Most of these stories these are a bunch of friends watching their 16-year-old best friend being buried after she was shot by a stray bullet in Long Beach. They went to a homecoming game together, and her best friend there in the middle was with her and survived the attack. So essentially, I wanted to go beyond the way we normally do, the way news media normally cover things, the way we just go for a day and we do this really cliched story and we photograph a memorial and then that's it. So it was my idea to do a comprehensive look at how this violence impacts communities, how it impacts families, and how it plays out over a long period of time. So for this project, I also did a 30-minute documentary film as a multimedia piece, and the LA Times, finally ended up running 7 pages of this story, and I was really proud of it because I didn't have a reporter with me. I was the one working my way into all the communities to tell these stories. And I think over time, I felt my editors didn't feel there was any money in these communities. A lot of people were subscribing to the paper, and there were not a lot of advertising dollars there. And so, it was my role as a photojournalist, a documentary photographer, to fight to make this happen, and it did. And so, I've covered these families for years and years and years. I met Davian shortly after he'd been shot sweeping outside a church when he was hit by he was actually attacked by a gang member and shot and left paralyzed. And so when we finally ran the story, I'd been photographing it for about 3 years. And so I've continued to work on this essay. I have the most comprehensive coverage of gang violence in Los Angeles. And the thing, after this story won a Pulitzer, the great news was that a lot of different newspapers and editors and photographers and writers started to emulate it. And the very sad thing about this story is that it could be told in any city in the United States. Now, we all know kids play with guns. It's nothing new. But what's different here is that these 2 young kids were reacting violently in the place 36 hours before their brother had been killed. He'd been shot standing outside the house. And so we have a whole community in Los Angeles where we have a whole population of kids who are showing symptoms of PTSD because we don't have the infrastructure to take care of their little psyches in the schools after they see this kind of violence. This was a family that I spent quite a bit of time with, and we often see this family, the little boy over here on the far left, he was 4 years old and he got hit by a stray bullet. And his 6-year-old sister picked him up off the sidewalk and carried him home to his mother and said, "Mommy, he's been hit, he's been shot." And the thing is that just because people live in impoverished neighborhoods doesn't mean that they should have to be subjected to this kind of violence without there being any kind of consequences. And so it was my role as a photojournalist to educate people who live in Beverly Hills to say, hey, listen, not everybody lives with this fantasy, very kind of Hollywoodish lifestyle. And I wanted to show people that this is what happens in areas where you never go to and you never know, you've never been in your life. And they're essentially 7 miles apart from one another. So I think I'll end it here and continue with our discussion.
Hi, so I'm Michelle, and I'm going to be the moderator. I'm an art historian, and as Amanda mentioned, I have an interest in the medium of performance art and its documentation and how that relationship is kind of structured by the current political climate in Russia, which basically means that I think a lot about how notions of truth and authenticity and the real as opposed to falseness and simulation and unreality are manifested in and imaged by art, politics, and mass media. So I'm going to, I think, begin by asking some questions that kind of draw out the shared themes of the panel and kind of put your practices into dialogue. So I wanted to sort of raise this issue of truth value as it relates to the medium of film and photography, which most of you touched on in some way. So I'm wondering if maybe we could discuss a little bit more how your work either employs or interrogates this idea that photography and film have some kind of like evidentiary relationship to the material world, and to sort of bring it back to the title of the panel to kind of think a little bit more about whether this currency of the real that photography and film are traditionally thought to have, whether that becomes like more powerful in a world that's inundated by fake news, or whether it's increasingly sort of difficult to think of photography as providing some sort of trace of the real when the world is also at the same time kind of increasingly saturated by visual images that transform and even construct reality rather than necessarily reflect or represent it.
Okay, ladies, I'll leave that to you.
There's a lot there, so whatever, yeah.
Question.
I can take this one. Well, a lot of my work is kind of like, it sort of centers around this idea that I sort of heard in college, which now is like really trite, that a documentary film is more just a framing device for the subjectivity of the maker, as opposed to like a true statement about another person or subject. So I feel like all my work kind of just took that idea and ran with it, like the idea that blew my mind when I was like 18, you know? To say which part? Oh, the quote was that documentary film is less of a like true statement about a person or subject and more of a framing device for the filmmaker's subjectivity. So that's something I'm constantly trying to foreground in my work, which is also why I appear so often in my own work. Kind of like saying that this is a performance, that this whole thing is a performance. All of these images are a performance of my own relationship to this person, and not actually, could actually have nothing to do with this person, because it's all coming out of me.
And is that sort of reflected in particular ways in not just your choice of subject matter, but also maybe in like the form and structure and presentation of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the strategies I use besides reenactment is to kind of take as many different sort of like well-worn cinematic tropes as possible and mix them all together. So I'll use like conventional narrative filmmaking that like adheres to the 180-degree line or whatever, and then give the camera to the person I'm making a movie about, and then I'll dress up like them, and then I'll just have iPhone footage. So as soon as you kind of get used to one way of looking, the mode switches. So it's kind of like constantly reminding you, that it's constructed.
I guess the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about photography in the case of my work isn't necessarily so much about truth, but about perspective, or which I guess can sometimes be the opposite of truth, or maybe is closer to the truth, depending on how you look at it. But thinking of like the difference of how you photograph, your uncle who's about to be drafted and sent off to war versus how you photograph, someone that you've just hauled out of their house and arrested with no cause. Like the way you take the photograph, I think maybe again, it's almost like saying more about how the photograph is being taken than what's in front of the camera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like your work is in a certain way a kind of response to how like the government uses photography as like something that purports to be a form of evidence, and you're kind of like pushing back against that. Does that sound
Yeah, definitely.
right? Yeah.
I think both in the photography and in the government letterhead of like something that comes on an FBI document is supposed to, that's why I use this word truthiness, right? Like it has this air of truth, but almost all of the information is gleaned from informants who, are notoriously like the least reliable, furnishers of information. So and even like the whole idea of this archive as being somehow true and representative of the events sort of crumbles when you start to think about how desperate and maniacal COINTELPRO was at that time.
And I think my work is grounded in documentary, reportage, and so I try as hard as I can for it to be authentic, because I really I'm an informer mostly for my community, to allow people to understand what's happening. And so I try to tell the most honest and realistic story that I can. And that's sort of in my profession as a photojournalist, but I never went to photojournalism school. I have a degree in fine arts, and I studied fine arts. That was my foundation. And so I have this tick-tock in my brain where I'm always doing one style or another style. So, I mean, I love the fact that with conceptual work, you get to create everything, and you are sort of the controller of the vision and how you feel and how you want to see and the message you want to get across. Whereas my work as a documentary photographer, it's more about presenting what is happening in communities from more of a humanitarian perspective.
Mm-hmm. So you would maybe like push back on that kind of quote Mariah gave at the beginning?
No, I just think they're very different realms, and I think I have a really great understanding and appreciation for photography in all different aspects and shapes and sizes that it comes in. Maybe if you had a traditional photojournalist here, they'd be like, huffing and scuffing. But, I'm open to all types and styles of photography. What I will say, though, is what's really disappointing for me is I just saw the Brassaï exhibit out there, and there's a piece from a brothel that Brassaï went into, and because you can't photograph in brothels because it's hard, he got his friend and he staged the whole thing. And so I don't know if it was presented as candid and factual at the time, or I'm still trying to figure that out. The exhibit just broke my heart. So I think that's really interesting. Just because it's photojournalism and documentary, it doesn't mean that it always follows the guidelines that we hope. So I'm not sure, but that was very interesting for me to see. Like, did he pass it off as factual? Or did he pass it off as, this is what I'm doing because we can't? I don't know. I'd have to find that book and read about it.
Okay, so then to maybe sort of follow up a little bit on that, maybe we can talk a little bit about the status of fantasy and like the imaginative in your work, and whether there's perhaps a way in which those kind of categories become almost like more true or more real, given the sort of like, again, to bring it back to the panel, the sort of context of fake news.
I'll just take that one quickly. I think that, there's one thing when you're creating an installation or an art piece and everybody understands that they're coming to the table and it's open for their interpretation and an appreciation of the artist's sensibility. Now we're living in an era where documentary photography and journalism is now morphing over to this side where you don't know what's real and you don't know what's accurate and you don't know what's reality, and that's incredibly dangerous, especially in the world of journalism. And I just read a report, professors at MIT, they just came out with a study showing that on Twitter, fake news is going to run probably 1,500 times quicker than reality will. Reality just crawls behind, and how you get way more hits with fake news stories, and people are gravitating towards that a lot quicker than they are to reality. And so we have to, as a society, look at this and see how we can curb this ecosystem of news, because how are we going to, at some point, tell what's true and what's not? And what's really interesting is that politics is what is being shared quicker than anything. These falsehoods, fake political stories. So we live in tricky times.
Agreed. Yeah, I mean, although I don't work, in a journalistic manner, although it is like historical references, I try to, closely follow what I think is some of the, most important and journalism with the most integrity that's happening right now. And so I'm always thinking about, what journalists are up against, both with like newspaper layoffs and with fake news and like, memes and AIs multiplying at like an exponential rate. And I think it definitely affects the way that we engage with all types of, viewer and spectatorship relationships, regardless of the context. I think it is like a great privilege of being an artist to sort of allow for these abstract spaces, which is sometimes the spaces I think are the most true, the most pared down, the most essential, the most like soul, when you strip everything else away. These like dark, unknown, unseeable spaces that exist beyond language. While it sounds, almost too good to be true or frivolous, I think that there is actually a really deep need to sort of trip out in some of those places in order to bring us to some type of sense that can actually make sense in the material world. So that's like, to me, what those glitterscapes propose.
Let's see. Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, I was just listening to the radio on the way over here, and the person on the radio was talking about how like now you can sort of CG one politician's face onto another one's body and have like somebody else's words coming out of their mouth. And I mean, I think a lot of the work I've been making, the things I've been thinking about, have been sort of like pushing back against this notion of like an authority, like journalistic authority on truth. But it's like now the whole administration is doing that, and it's like, no, there needs to be some kind of safe structure for artists to butt up against, It's like now everybody's
on the same playing field.
It's like, can't all do that. But at the same time, I like do really question a lot of, I don't know, it's like, that's my origin story is basically rooted in fake news. Like after that news story aired, my dad had to leave the country because he got death threats from loyalists and the IRA, and he never would have met my mom if he had stayed. I don't know if he'd be alive if he stayed, but so I mean that was going on in 1971 too. It just was like way cruder and much easier to spot from like my perspective now. It's like this. He's like, David hopes to go to work as a salesman. It's like so hokey and like easy to dismantle. Whereas now it's like so insidious. So I don't know, I'm really torn on that. It's kind of messing with my practice actually, that there's all this fake news. It's like, yeah, I do want there to be some kind of grounding, like truth, grounded truth. But then it's like, your project is talking about how the structures that govern and like the authorities on, truth and righteousness have been like dirty dealing forever, and we all know that. So I don't know. It's complicated.
I mean, it's all born out of documentary on some level. Everything the three of us do here. One is a little more interpretive, whereas one isn't. But it's all rooted in reality on some form or another. But I was really shocked about that BBC piece. I was like, you got to be kidding me. The BBC?
We thought that they were the good guys, but they're not.
Wow. Tricky.
Okay, well, another sort of way to kind of frame that question, which we've all sort of touched on, is maybe to speak a little bit more about the persuasiveness of photography in film, like sort of, again, resulting from its kind of like authority, like you just mentioned, but also its legibility and also its reproducibility, like how widely it can be disseminated, and whether you see perhaps some kind of tension between the socio-political implications of the medium for that reason. So on the one hand, photography and film's capacity to maybe like promote change by sharing information or making visible things that are perhaps otherwise invisible, or even like attempting to elicit like empathetic responses. But then on the other hand, the way that this sort of assumption of truthfulness, and again, this like authority and legibility can be used for political and even, in some cases, commercial gains.
Okay, there's a lot in that, what you just said. So I'm just trying to figure out how to approach that. I think that I think we live in an era where, going back to news, I think there's a lot of people who want to be the star of their Facebook page, and so they're creating these, you know, showing truthiness, where it's really, you know, we're in a time where we have photography that is being manipulated quite heavily. It's being passed off as truths when it's not. We're seeing a lot of young photographers being kicked out of the business. We're seeing older photographers being kicked out of the business. And so I don't know who's winning here. Is reality winning, or is this fake news winning? And I think as the photojournalism world shrinks, it's open to anybody then. Like, who are the gatekeepers now? You know, and that's really important. Nobody seems to care about the gatekeepers of the world of journalism, but you know, it's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and a lot of this work is not being vetted anymore. So the New York Times gets screwed, the LA Times gets screwed. A lot of people get screwed because people aren't vetting information anymore, and they're moving on it so quickly. And you know, everything's about ratings, everything's about reporting in the moment, and we're making a lot of mistakes, and a lot of disinformation is starting to spread like wildfire, and you can't go back after that, right? It's really hard to correct a wrong, as we know from our last political election. So I think it's a tricky time. I'll let you ladies pick up the rest.
Could you narrow the question a little bit for me?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just sort of wanted to think a little bit more about the kind of the social political implications of the sort of authority and persuasiveness of photography and film, and how, you know, that can be both used for for progressive purposes, but then it can also be very easily manipulated, as we're seeing, as Barbara just mentioned. And it does seem like a lot of that is sort of like a thing that seems to be like a subtext in all of your practices, potentially. So just wondering if you'd like to like elaborate on that. I mean, especially for yours, it does seem like you are, with the way that you kind of like annotate these documents, you are like thinking about that, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think people always, you know, have to be critical of images and image making, whether it's coming, or regardless of where it's coming from, and regardless of whether it's, you know, purporting to be an advertisement, but you know that it's like dripping in sexism, or, you know, upholding a fake beauty standard that was very much like designed differently at specific times in history to uplift certain people or sell certain products, or whether it's, you know, a documentary photographer, but also like, you know, thinking about the different experiences and layered experiences that happen in one place, right? So like, I've lived in Compton, and that's not my experience, but that doesn't mean that it's not an experience. So, I mean, I think the most important, like, to try to get to some truth is never gonna be, there's never one truth, so maybe something that could come out of this time when at least everyone knows that, like, haters will say it's photoshopped and like nothing's real and everything's a meme. At least maybe there's like a literacy about the problems of image making for like a wider range of people, whereas maybe like artists and photojournalists used to be, you know, some of the people most concerned with that. And I think that that also goes for like this government surveillance and these government documents. I mean, I think we've seen a lot of things come out, you know, with like why our countries decided to go to war, or why our countries deciding to pass certain laws at certain moments, and we realize that it has nothing to do with, you know, national security, or nothing to do with the economy. I mean, none of these things are like relegated to the past, right? So thinking specifically about government surveillance, there's like this new FBI category that's come out in the past year or so called Black Identity Extremists. Have you guys heard about this? I think it was first reported on like Foreign Foreign Affairs. The Democracy Now! Had a really great piece about it, and it's starting to get a lot more attention, but basically it's a fabrication, or I think of like as a hallucination by the FBI about what they think Black Lives Matter activists are engaged in. So there's always this conflating of black activism with violence, even though there's no historical basis for it. So it's this new category that's being used to investigate young activists working today. And so to me, it's like the exact same, like literally it's a lie. Like that's actually not a thing. Mm-hmm. Like there are not Black American terrorist organizations. Mm-hmm. But this is like in the language of our police departments are being trained about this, you know, hallucination. So, yeah.
Yeah. Everybody has Instagram, right? And we all love Instagram and we all use it. But it's that sensibility of changing the reality of what's there because it looks cool and using all your different filters because it looks better. This notion of changing the reality for aesthetic is now finding its way into the media. And it's very, very tricky between what is real and what isn't real and what is this and what isn't that. And like I said, it goes back to not having the resources to vet properly anymore. So it's tricky.
Yeah, I'm teaching right now, and I was talking to my students. We were watching some video art from the 90s, and there was like this critique of advertising, and there, I heard the word commercial in your question. And we got in this conversation about advertising, and it was like really awkward for them to talk about advertising. It's like not something people think about the way that we thought about it in like the late 90s, early 2000s. Yeah. And, you know, I was like, you know, when I was a young person, there were like very clear divisions between socializing and advertising. And I was like, that's such a weird thing to say, you know, that's not true anymore, that like ads are embedded in our social lives now. I don't really know if that addresses your question.
It does. No. It does. It does.
Yeah, absolutely.
The lines are blurred right now, and that's not necessarily a good thing. No.
Yeah, one does wonder, though, that if everyone is using Instagram and themselves manipulating images, that perhaps actually makes them aware of image manipulation as like a really regular practice.
It becomes a norm.
Right.
And the more likes you get, the more you do it.
But then perhaps also you don't any longer assume that every image is just like completely indexical, right? That it might have been amended in some way, because you're doing that too.
I mean, I would, only because I'm someone who's trained to examine images all the time, essentially. But there's a lot of people who would never know the difference between fake and reality because they don't assume that that's where we go when that happens. They just take it for granted. Oh, that's a great image. But you're like, well, wait a minute. That person wasn't there. And it's one thing if you're working on a conceptual piece. That's fantastic. Create everything like Nan Goldin is great. But when you're trying to pass off fiction as reality, that's when there's a problem.
Should we open it up to the audience?
I have a question for Barbara. You said something at the beginning of your talk that was interesting to me, and I'd love to hear a little more about it, about getting your stories placed in the LA Times, and about how because there wasn't a lot of like advertising revenue from people that you were representing, that it was hard to get the story placed. And I'm just curious to know a little bit more about the kind of machinery of how that works in terms of how photojournalistic stories get placed, what you had to do in terms of advocating for the story. Just some more information about sort of how that all works.
Sure. And there is a lot of editorializing that goes on, which also shapes the news that you're bringing to the table as well. But I saw a direct link from what I was doing overseas to when I moved to Los Angeles pretty early on. I came here in 2007, and I met a young woman who had been shot 3 times, was paralyzed from the waist down, running to save her children from violence that was happening at the end of the street. We never covered that story. I couldn't believe that something like that could happen and we hadn't covered it. The only reason why we found out about it was because one of the detectives reached out to the reporter, who was really active in doing a lot of social issue stories. And so I met Rose, and Rose was the basis for my stories. And then I would meet other families, and I would say to my editors, we really need to do a comprehensive piece on this. Our coverage is really shallow. And I couldn't convince them. For a full year, they said no, 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 no. And then I finally went storming into my editor's office and said, why did you bring me here? You're not letting me do what I do. I'm a documentary photographer who's rooted in social issues. We have a huge issue happening in our community, and just because there's not a lot of revenue dollars coming out of there, you guys aren't interested. That's not right. What's our mission statement? And so I was, I think, on the verge of tears and rage at the same time, and then she finally said, okay, look, my editor said, you've got 6 months. Go and find me the families that this is happening to. Show me that this is an issue. Show me who these people are. So I hustled in between my assignments. I met all the community leaders in all the different areas of Los Angeles, and I spent a lot of time documenting other stories in the communities so that we could get those stories in our paper, right? And so eventually I managed to get everybody on board, and when they, it's a great phone. And so, you know, I had to fight tooth and nail, and not everybody's going to fight tooth and nail for a story, because you alienate your editors, you piss them off, there's, you know, baggage that comes along with doing that kind of stuff. But I was really adamant about this story because I hadn't ever been shot, nobody in my family had been shot, but I understood loss really profoundly because my mother had just died from cancer maybe 4 months before I started this story. And so that's what fueled me to tell these stories, because I felt that these were underreported, these were unheard voices. I saw how they were grieving. That resonated with me very intimately, and it fueled my desire to make sure that this got in the paper. And they ran 7 pages in the A section afterwards. Took me 2 years, but that gave me the time to sort of give the breadth and the complexities to cover this story. And so it was a challenge. I bugged them. I fought with them. But it was well worth it.
I've got a question about, it's also follow-up for Barbara, about working in journalism. And it seems to me, certainly I've noticed it over the past few years, that political activism has become part of journalism. And I'm wondering if what you did, these were beautiful images, but they don't fit a particular politically active narrative. Which is to say that the violence in some of these communities is due mostly to bad behavior by the police. In other words, it's suggesting a narrative that there are internal problems within these communities, one of which is a policeman that are, and the images that you've shown don't even really support that, although you may have some others that do. But I'm wondering if at the times, or maybe after they were printed, these images, that you got some pushback because you weren't advancing a preferred narrative.
So when I originally pitched this story to them, it was very difficult to get my editors on board to document the gang members themselves. It's a very complex situation, you know. A lot of these gang members are kids that grow up in extremely dysfunctional homes. They find themselves leaving school because their attention span is not where it should be because the father maybe just killed the mother and the mother's... So it's a very complex issue, and I knew that, and obviously I recognized that. And so I had a very narrow narrative with which I was allowed to pursue. And my editor had said to me, I don't want any gangs in this piece. I don't want any, I'm not interested in that. It's cliched for us. We've documented it over and over and over again. So it was my role to truly tell the stories of what happened to, I have hundreds of photos. I have 10 here. And I only wanted to spend time with the cops at the end of it because sort of like a war zone, you're not on both sides. because it's tricky that way. You're not going to get the access you need. You pick one side, you stay with them, and in the very end, I thought I should probably have some of the cops here, right? That's a whole other story. That's a whole other story, driving around with those cops and what I saw. Everything you hear is true, essentially. And so I saw, you know, one day my editor yelled at me and said, "This is an advocacy piece. You're totally biased with this piece," and blah, 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 blah. And I said, "Yeah, you're right. I'm a secret. This is advocacy journalism for me. I'm like an undercover agent with this piece." And I said, "What are you going to tell me? When a 4-year-old gets shot in the head, there's 2 sides to that story? It's wrong. It's wrong." You know, I really wanted to tell the story of the gang members as well. How do they end up here? It's a circle, right? How are they here, and why are they here, and what's happened to them? But I was, you know, I felt, can I at least get part of the story in to at least tell the people we never, I mean, the gang culture is so deeply entrenched in our pop culture that you never see the pictures of the people that have been impacted by the violence, right? And so that's why I went that way. But there were constraints and there were narrative guidelines, but I felt in some ways that I had failed in the sense that I felt like I made it almost seem like, well, they're the bad guys. But it wasn't, it's not 100% true, you know? The gang members themselves, you know. They have a whole story to be told as well. But when I was working on this story, the LA Times wasn't interested in that. But yeah, so advocacy journalism is changing now that we have a lot of people who are becoming activists. The greatest invention that's ever happened is iPhone video. We're able to bust all these cops that are doing bad things, and we're able to bust a lot of people who are doing bad things. So now you have all kinds of citizen journalists out there who do have, I don't want to say the word agenda, but do have points of view. I'm not supposed to have a point of view as a journalist. But I think when you tell us a long-term story that has a heavy social issue, it's almost impossible to not become emotionally invested and emotionally involved with the people you're documenting. To me, that's very different from daily newspaper photography. You're really supposed to stay on this side of the line, and that's easy. But there are people using, it's more, I love it. I love to see advocacy journalism. That's part of the reason why I left a staff job, because I wasn't able to really voice my opinion through my work.
What do you feel, you mentioned fake news and fake photography. I guess, again, this is Barbara, but just because journalism is presenting truths or purports to present truths. But what do you feel is the most egregious fake photograph or fake news that you've witnessed recently?
There's so much. You know, the work that these two ladies do, it's really inspiring to me because they're openly interpreting reality, and I like that. But like I said, it's rooted in documentary. Whereas now you have people who are blatantly saying that they're journalists and they're not presenting reality. And that's really very, very dangerous. So what is the most egregious? I've seen so much, honestly. I saw this young kid, a young man. He was the newest thing in the industry, in the photojournalism, and he was scooped up by a lot of really prominent photographers, and he was given a lot of opportunities, and people really loved his vision. And guess what? This kid was, sorry, it's kind of unbelievable. Mary Ellen Mark's series of the brothel workers. This guy would go to the brothels in India and then come back and superimpose Mary Ellen Mark's imagery into those photographs. Nobody picked it up. It was unbelievable. This kid went on to win all these prestigious prizes in the photojournalism world, in the museum world. This kid was really, really rising super fast. And finally, an activist in India said, wait a minute, Mary Ellen Mark worked here with me in these centers. I see her images within these images. So, you know, he was finally caught and he was brought down, and there was a huge public shaming and then a virtual stoning, which I don't really agree with. But I always recommend to people read 4 or 5 different sources of every news you get, because it's so divided now, it's so divisive. You've got Fox News that is essentially fueling the right-wing agenda. You've got other news agencies that are fueling the other agenda. So I don't know. I would highly recommend that you really carefully examine your news, the sources, where it's coming from, get different opinions.
Thank you. I think I have a general question. One of the things that I think about a lot in terms of artists making work that's representational to their experience versus, you know, documenting from the outside, and how if you're working for a newspaper, ultimately that's, you know, unless it's, you know, publicly funded, it's going to want to sell stuff. So that's part of the machine of capitalism that causes a lot of the trickle-down effects of the things that it's documenting, in my opinion. And, you know, like as artists, we're not like exempt from that, you know, blood money or whatever you want to call it. But at the same time, like with representation, I was just thinking about like trauma and how the impulse to explore trauma within your own family experience or life experience, and how that becomes how that's like a way of speaking macrocosmically, you know, by going into your story microcosmically, which I see, you know, that you two doing. And then with the journalism, it's almost like, I wonder, this may just be me like wanting to get into someone's psyche, but like the impulse to go into trauma situations that aren't part of your narrative necessarily. I'm thinking about a woman that I met at a residency who was this white woman from England, and she was this tiny white lady, and she would go to Yemen and like hang out with all of these, she was like doing all this stuff and putting her life in a lot of danger, and she had some stuff that was not really, like, she realized that after a while she had actually trauma in her own life and violence that she wanted to sort of explore. So I'm just wondering if you see that as a relationship in terms of like with Barbara and then with you two, like if you've ever struggled with wanting to go into representation or trauma of another community or something and had to like steer it back to your own narrative, or was it always just like an impulse? And I don't want to say trauma, like I don't want to put trauma on you guys, like that's a heavy word to say, but I guess I would say that's what I would use for myself, and I guess, yeah, sorry, it's a long question. Comment.
It's a big question. I actually, one of the slides I cut out of my presentation sort of spoke to this, but no, not that one. There's two other ones that I cut out. I made a film in 2014 about U.S. War veterans who came back and became stuntmen, and so I saw it as like the sort of like therapeutic reenactment of trauma, but also like they had been trained to use their bodies as tools to earn a living, or to put their bodies in danger as a tool to earn a living. So I saw them as sort of like part of this machine of capitalism that was mirrored both in the military and in Hollywood. Wait, did I say that they were stuntmen? Yeah, okay, good. But that project was like born, so yeah, most of the time I'll incorporate myself into the film because I don't want to ask anyone to sort of participate in making my work, which is going to like enhance my career, not necessarily do anything for them, without like putting my own neck on the line, so to speak, and doing the same thing I'm asking of them. And that film, I had a really hard time figuring out how to like weasel my way into it to like absolve my own guilt around representing other people's trauma. But the reason I was interested in this in the first place is because a lot of the men in my family are war veterans, and because I didn't understand the impulse to like be sort of traumatized and then choose to sort of be re-traumatized. And the way I was thinking about it was that I had a sort of near-death experience where I broke my back, and And I was like, I would never like just start jumping out of planes now, you know. It was like I fell from a large height. So I was like, my experience was not what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It was what doesn't kill you makes you weaker and more afraid of hurting yourself. So one of the veterans was a Rolfer, the guy who was a Navy SEAL, was like a therapeutic body worker, and I had him work on me, and I like showed my scar, and it's not something that I like incorporated into the narrative of the film, but that was the way that I saw my connection to the material and to their trauma. And another thing that I tried to do was not ask them any direct questions about their trauma. I was never like, did you kill anyone? Did you ever see anybody die? Like, I had sort of pretty generic questions and let them offer up whatever they wanted to tell me. And I'm actually struggling with the same thing around my dad, because, you know, he's got all sorts of trauma from like poverty, from sort of like post-colonial war situation, from, you know, I don't know, like all kinds of stuff. And so I'm kind of trying to negotiate, like, how much of this do I have a right to sort of like publicly investigate? And some things I know for sure are off limits, but yeah, it's been taking me a long time to finish this one because of that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, trauma isn't a word that I typically used very much, like, before 5 years ago. I think, like, sometimes the word sort of undoes itself, but sometimes it's the right word, and it's definitely something that I thought about when reading through this file and just thinking about like how inherently violent, you know, our own government was to my family. And I actually just felt like really, really lucky that my dad is alive and here. And I think, you know, the point of the project was less about like getting to the truth. It's definitely not about convincing anybody. It's really just for us. And it's to make us feel loved and seen and honored, and to like thank you know, my family, not just my dad, but my entire family, for being survivors and for being like joyous survivors. So even though there's a lot of really painful elements in the work, there's always meant to be some celebration for like the poetry and, you know, dance parties and things that happen all around, you know, people who can be dealing with a great amount of trauma, but like not letting that dull the shine. And so that's something I think even more about than maybe truth is love. So thank you for that question.
I'll just answer this as quick. You know, I'll answer it quickly. It's funny, you know, for some reason, I don't know why people always assume they project onto me how I grew up, where I came from, by how I look. And I find that really interesting because there seems to be this narrative of privilege that seems to be attached to me for some reason. And it's really quite funny because my work has a direct link to where I came from and how I was raised. And you know, my parents immigrated from Ireland. They came to Canada, and they brought all these bundles of family photographs because my grandfather was a photographer. And so I used to spend hours just staring at those pictures to learn about my family, because I had no connection with all my extended family because we couldn't afford to fly to Ireland and see them. And so my parents had 7 kids, and so you can imagine 7 crazy kids with no family infrastructure. You know, my father was like Don Draper from Mad Men, so my house was unbelievable chaos. And, you know, when I talk about it, I've only recently started to connect all the dots and talk about it, and I could go in and it could all become very, very dark. But I choose to just say that I don't talk about that stuff for any kind of sympathy or anything, but it's more to sort of tell the story of how my upbringing had a direct impact on the type of journalist I would become. And so I really wanted to tell the stories of people suffering quietly, the stories that people don't really know. the stories that people assume. And so it's kind of funny for me because, like I said, everybody assumes I come from this place. I don't come anywhere near from that place. It's kind of a miracle I'm sitting on this panel talking to you guys, really. So my upbringing has driven the kind of work that I do, and it's had a profound impact on it. So yeah, and now I'm pulling it back a little bit from all the violence because you have to heal your psyche and your mind and your soul because you can't keep on running, right? Otherwise you turn into a mad person. So, you know, life imitates art.
Hi, so I recently have just been thinking about my own conceptions of truth and of course he's gonna, sorry. He takes, as soon as he realizes that I'm slightly not paying attention to him, he's gonna get up and say hello. But so I've been thinking about my own conception of truth in my internal discourse about what that means for myself and my own work and how I kind of deal with the spectrum of truth that almost exists today, where there's one idea of what's right and what's wrong, and somebody else's idea of that can be completely oppositional to that.
I mean, I think like the problem for me kind of just boils down to like the right wing discovering postmodern theory and like using it. Like it just seemed like the purview of the left for so long. So yeah, I think that's kind of also where my ambivalence is coming from. It's like, oh, everybody's doing this thing where they're like, you know, pulling at the thread of these modernist ideas about what's right and wrong and hierarchies and yeah, and like gatekeepers, as you mentioned, like who are the gatekeepers of truth? And so yeah, that's messing with my head, but I'm just like plodding along a little bit more slowly than I was before, along pretty much the same track. Yeah, just because other people interpret different things as right and wrong than I might doesn't mean that I shouldn't keep that investigation going from my perspective.
Can I just answer that super quickly? It's really funny. I was doing a shoot for the New York Times, and we were covering this really right-wing sort of rally, and I can't remember all the details, but anyway, it was when I was walking into the room when they were having their evening gala, blah, blah, blah. These women took me aside, and they were literally with tears in their eyes. Can you please, will you please tell the true story? Can you please tell the accurate story of what's happening here? You lie so much. All of you guys in New York Times, you lie all the time. Can you just please, can you please? So I'm representing the New York Times, so I can't say what I really want to say, and I'm like, oh, of course, you know, that's what we do, and blah, 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 blah. But I was shocked by how deeply entrenched in lies they are. There is no seeing the other side of the fence. Just the you know, the right wing sort of propaganda. Oh, well, I can't remember who we documented at that point, but they thought we were saying, you know, they didn't like anything that's right wing. If it's not published in the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times or whatever, they get angry. They think that we have an agenda. They think that we're not interested in their platform. They think that we never cover them. We don't cover them honestly. They think, sorry? But you do cover them. Of course. Yes, of course. Yes. Sorry, I was getting emotional about it, and I was missing the. I just wanted to know what you were saying. Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. So essentially, what I'm saying is that they believe this myth that all the left-wing media is not telling their story honestly, and that's tricky. You know, I've said tricky probably 50 times here today, and it's completely unfounded in truth. So they're all brainwashed, as far as I'm concerned.
We have one more question. Thank you for your patience, panelists.
I had a question for each of you, but I'm just going to keep it to one, real simple and fast. you said there was in the 1500s a transgender conquistador. I was interested in a title, a book, or anything like that.
It's called The Lieutenant Nun. And the person's name is Catalina de Arauso. They're a Basque conquistador. Yeah. But it's pretty unreliable narrative because it was what was used. Well, it is, but yeah, since the, obviously since the colonial period,
the travel memoirs is like the original fake news.
Yeah, but the memoir was used as a way of exonerating like any potential crimes against the church for like gender bending. So their argument was like they were inspected by nuns and found to be an intact virgin. So it was like okay that they were dressing like a man, but there's actually like sex scenes in the book, and it's just like they were butch top, so that's why they were found to be an intact virgin. So yeah, it's like this really weird, like it had an agenda, this memoir, so it's kind of like unclear whether they wrote it or if it was dictated to somebody, but we know the purpose was to glorify their service to the crown.
Thank you to our panelists, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.